project herself. Now, of course, I want this to sound as mean and silly as it sounds, I say, well, what is this astral self that you're talking about? And if you're taking these astral soul trips, can you tell me where you're going? If you tell me you went to Washington, D.C. on one of these trips, I would ask you what you did while you were in Washington, D.C. And unsurprisingly, if you can't give me any specific concrete details, you're giving me no reason to what? Yeah, you're giving me no reason to believe you. No reason to take you seriously. In other words, I expect there to be some kind of verifiable, tangible proof. But yeah, my aunt and Descartes and whoever would say, well, the true you is your mind. And your mind in this current state of being, your mind inhabits your body. And to use that phrase, ghost in the machine, you know, the mind is the ghost in the machine. The real you is this ghost. The physical you that you see isn't the real you. Even though the big problem there is, I know that the real me, or what we call the real me, is basically based upon what blueprint that I did not choose. Well, I'm a genetic code pretty much. Everything about me is the function of my genetic code. Everything. Yes?
I just want to know, like, how would he describe multiple personality disorder then?
Well, he wouldn't, but some other philosophers might. Well, he would, sadly enough, have to explain it how. And this is sort of the problem. This is sort of the crux of it. I don't know how he could get around not explaining it chemically. And by the way, this does cause a problem for Cartesian dualism. Because if we can actually solve your mental issues, and by the way, we can solve some of your mental issues by, instead of talking about them as mental problems, what do we now often talk about mental problems as? Yeah, we talk about them as physical problems. In other words, we might get you meds to fix your mental problem. Now, this would seem to suggest that mental problems can be explained as what? Physical problems. And if mental problems can be explained as physical problems, why talk about mental problems at all anymore? As a matter of fact, to speak of mental problems seems to be superfluous from a reductive standpoint. And if reductive explanations are more productive for curing mental illness, then why are we even talking about mind problems anymore? Now, this is a position taken by a writer during the 70s named Paul Churchland, who argued for a position called eliminative materialism, which won't be on the test. But he contends that our speak of mental issues and minds is so off target, conceptually, that we would be better off dispensing with it altogether. Because think of how much our thinking of mental illnesses as physical illnesses has improved our, what shall I say, our rate of dealing with the problems. Now, I will admit that there might be a little flaw in the ointment here. If you've never had a nervous breakdown, I don't recommend it to anyone. Good, I got a couple chuckles there. I would also contend that most of our friends who have had midlife crises, they're actually wrong about it. Their midlife crisis is what we will call later in this semester an existential crisis. It just so happens people tend to have these existential crises If they don't have them earlier, they tend to have them at midlife. When you start to ask yourself questions like, is this self I have been a self worth calling a self? Is the life I have lived a life worth calling my life? And you might start to wonder, if you need to change course, or maybe something even more drastic. Well, your therapist might offer you meds. Hey, you're going through a rough patch. You might need these meds to get you over the hump. However, with Descartes, I might say, I realize the meds won't actually solve the what? Won't actually solve the problem. Because an existential crisis seems to be more than a what? Yeah, it seems to be more than just a physical problem. In other words, it seems to be a problem related to how you are, quote unquote, thinking about things. And this is why some of us still find cognitive approaches to be useful. Maybe not useful in dealing with all of what we used to call mental problems, but at least something like this existential or midlife crisis that I'm talking about. And this is why your therapist might say, well, I'd like you to go home and read this before you come in for therapy next time. Now, of course, your reading it can be explained neurophysiologically. But there is something to this act of understanding which can be explained chemically, but it seems to be what? Understanding seems to be so much more than just synapses firing, even though they are firing. And this is because there is something that is like to comprehend something. And if you comprehend something that says, oh, that's another way of looking at things. I was looking at things this way, and now maybe I want to look at things this way. I'm talking about ideas in the mind. Even though those ideas in the mind certainly correspond to brain states, there are some who would say they are not just brain states. Otherwise, cognitive therapy would never be able to what? Cognitive therapy wouldn't work. And meds would actually be effective at fixing what? Everything, as long as we figured out what the right meds were. I think if I had gotten meds to try to get over the hump, it would have just made me what? Something I don't want to be, numb. Numb's the last thing I want to be. Yeah, I'd rather, the visceral sensation of pain is better than being numb. But yeah, cognitive therapy wouldn't be able to work. So it seems to some of us, me included, that even if you can explain thoughts in terms of synapses firing and so forth, there seems to be another level to it also. And of course, this other level is what Descartes would call my mind, my soul, myself. And by the way, you can believe Descartes' position in part without buying the whole package. For example, I can believe that I have this thing that I call mind that is dependent upon my having a brain, without my believing what about my mind? I don't have to believe it's the same thing as what Christians call a soul. Because some of us think that is taking too much of a leap. Yeah, Mr. Toberman.
Couldn't one argue that our conscious just interprets our brain states and makes us think that we're thinking more than we actually are?
Yeah, and that would be the same way of looking at it if you made that observation I talked about earlier. If indeed, quote unquote, decisions are made in our brains before we are made conscious of it, that begs the question if this thing that we call the self is really as quote-unquote conscious as we, think it is?
41, I believe.
Oh, good.
That also kind of plays off what I was saying, which is the brain is just a conductor for the mind. Maybe what these mental illnesses are is the brain not acting as an effective conductor for the mind.
Yeah. Now, of course, if we talk about a conductor for the mind, that might presuppose that the mind is in fact separate and distinct.
Yep, that's kind of a dualism.
Yeah.
There.
And of course, the materialist might accept the idea that the brain does emerge out of mental states, but the materialist would have a problem calling them separate and distinct. In reality, even if we can talk about them that way. I'm not denying that I can't talk about my mind and my brain separately, but I don't know that they really are separate and distinct. Now, before we go, this is important. These are the kind of problems that lead us into talking not just about the problem of free will, but also lead us into this problem that we call the self and personal identity. With a little bit of time I have left, I at least want to lay out the model of the self that is adopted during this period. And folks, I do recommend you check this out in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy that I have a link to for you if you're interested in it. The prevalent model that will emerge out of Cartesian thought, but it will also be accepted by John Locke, who we'll be talking about in the next chapter, is sometimes called the psychological continuity model of the self. What I love so much about this name is it kind of tells you exactly what they mean by the self. Your self is this peculiar thing that, as Descartes put it, it doesn't take up any what? Doesn't take up any space, but it does indeed do what? It persists through time, and it is the part of you that has this thing. It's the part of you that has experience. And by the way, the self is almost always, as Descartes put it, the self is thought of as identical with the what? Yeah, it's identical with Descartes' mind-soul. Now, we tend to think of ourself as a concept that is it is in some sense stable, but admittedly constantly what? But it does subtly change over time with experience. According to this model, I am somehow consistent with myself when I was 16 years old. Even though I certainly look what? A little more grizzled, to say the least. I've gotten older, I've gone through experiences, and these experiences, and this is going to sound materialist, my experiences are imperfectly stored as what? Stored. Yeah, we tend to connect our selfhood with this mental thing that is most truly me, that has experiences somehow stored in my memory. Now, admittedly, memory is not what? We know that memory is not what people thought it was at one point. It's not like a film projector that does what? that faithfully records events. Because my mind is an adaptive sort of thing that actually experiences things. And experience is not like a video recording. Because what happens? I notice certain things and I don't notice other things. I forget certain things and I embellish other things. My experience is admittedly not a faithful recording of past events. Now, there is a philosopher that if you're planning to write this paper that you'll get a chance to read. And you'll be reading about him in chapter 10 for next time. I'm talking about David Hume. David Hume will argue that this psychological continuity model of the self is really an unfounded model. And this is because what he will argue is this thing that you call the self is so much changing over time that there really is no stable concept of the self. Because after all, the self that you have is indeed dependent upon physical properties. If you take yourself to be a sum total of your experience and your memories, what are constantly happening to your memories?
Diminishing.
Yeah, they're changing, they're diminishing. And granted, this isn't so much a David Hume example, but it's one he would appreciate. There's been plenty of science fiction made about stuff like this. Plenty of Philip K. Dick novels have been turned into films. You could certainly implant memories into me that what?
Affected yourself?
Yeah, well, I say that may not have even happened. But if you implanted them into me, I would certainly define myself in terms of those. For those of you who haven't seen the original Blade Runner, the original one is quite different from the book that it was based on. But they have these biological entities that are produced by a corporation called replicants, and they found that to control replicants, it paid to give them a past. In other words, to implant them with memories. Because those memories could be used to what? Unsurprisingly, control them. Because to believe that you have a past might also mean to believe that you have a future. Now, one of the main replicants in the film, she didn't know that she was a replicant. And B, she did not know that her memories were not what? Yeah, well, they were real to her, but they weren't her memories. They had never happened. As the replicant Decker put it, played by Harrison Ford, he said, "Rachel, those are not your memories. Those are Tyrell's niece's memories." Now, of course, I am not a replicant as far as I know. Good. I wanted to leave that one out there. But I really can't be certain that my so-called memories actually happened to me. Because there's been plenty of cases where I thought that I remembered something, but then someone else said, "No, that's not how it happened because I was there." And we find out that our memory actually isn't the way things really happened. We remember things the last time we thought about it, which is, guess what? Different from the memory, which is different from that memory, and different from that memory. So, of course, who is this person? Who is this person? We'll pick up with this next time.